stop and think about that for a second. For a family of four, that could be an $8,000 check. That is absolutely life-changing money. And here's the really good news. These payments are almost always designed to help a broad range of people. We're talking about folks who work and pay taxes, retirees on Social Security, people who are unemployed, and of course, families with kids. You don't have to be living in poverty to qualify. Most middle-class households have been included in the past. The whole point is to help regular, everyday people.
So this all leads to the big question. If people need help and there's a history of giving it, what's the holdup? Well, it really boils down to two huge complications: the fear of inflation and just a massive flood of misinformation out there.
Okay, first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with inflation. All it really means is that your dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. The prices for everything, gas, groceries, you name it, they go up, and your money just buys less. This is the number one reason opponents of more stimulus bring up.
But was stimulus really the main villain? Well, the source material shows it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. You had massive supply chain problems, soaring energy costs, and a lot of companies just hiking up their prices. So stimulus was a factor, for sure, but it wasn't the whole story. And this is the debate policymakers are having. How do you help people who are hurting without making prices go up even more? And then there's the other big problem: misinformation. I mean, come on, you've seen posts like this all over your social media feed, right? They're designed to prey on your hope, on your desperation. And let's be real, they are almost always fake. And a lot of times they're straight up dangerous scams. So how do you protect yourself from this stuff? It's pretty simple. Be skeptical. Real official announcements will come from official places, like IRS.gov. It'll be on every major news network. If some random post promises you $5,000 a month, it's probably not real. And whatever you do, never, ever click on suspicious links. All this waiting and wondering, it can make you feel pretty powerless, but you're not. So let's shift gears. Let's talk about what you can actually do right now to put yourself in the best possible position. Here is a simple 4-step action plan. The first two are all about making it easy for the government to pay you. Go to the IRS website and make sure your address and bank info are up to date. And file your taxes, even if you have zero income and don't owe anything. Third, stay informed, but stick to reliable news sources. And finally, use your voice. Let your elected representatives know that you need help. It really does make a difference. Oh, and a super important side note here: if you think you might have missed out on that big payment from 2021, you might still be able to get it. It's called the Recovery Rebate Credit, and you claim it by filing a 2021 tax return. But you have got to act fast because that window to claim it is closing. Now, if a payment does get approved, having a plan for that money is everything. The sources suggest this priority list. Start with survival stuff: rent, food, keeping the lights on. Then immediately attack any high-interest debt: credit cards, payday loans, the stuff that's costing you money every single month. After that, build up some security, like a small emergency fund. Look, this isn't about being told what to do. It's just a smart strategy to turn that money into real, lasting stability. I really want to end with this thought because it's just so important to remember. If you're feeling that financial pressure, if you're worried about how you're going to make it to the end of the month, please know you are not alone in this. Millions and millions of your neighbors are going through the exact same thing, just hoping for a little bit of help. And that brings us to our last question, the one we want to leave you with. We've talked about the signs, the politics, the numbers, the scams, and how to prepare. So now it gets personal. If that money comes through, what's your plan? Seriously, having an answer to that question is maybe the most powerful thing you can do. Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating new study that completely rethinks those stimulus checks a lot of us received a few years back. It asks a really simple but powerful question. Was there a much smarter way to handle that economic rescue? The answer? Well, it might just change how we think about this stuff forever. Let's get into it. Yeah, you remember it, right? Seeing that direct deposit hit your bank account during what was a really, really uncertain time. For a lot of folks, it was an absolute lifeline. For others, well, maybe it just went straight into savings. This new research suggests that by being a lot more deliberate about who gets the money, we could create a system that's not just more powerful, but a whole lot more efficient too. So to really understand this new proposal, we first have to rewind and look at the old one. Economists have been digging through mountains of data from those 3 big stimulus rounds, and they found some pretty big problems with that money for everyone approach. Let's unpack what they learned.
Okay, so the first issue was just the sheer scale of it all. Checks went out to 85% of the entire US population. Think about that. The goal was to get money into the economy fast, no questions asked, but the study argues this was like using a fire hose to water a houseplant. It was just way, way too broad. And of course, that super broad approach came with a truly colossal price tag. We're talking about roughly $850 billion with a B. That's an incredible amount of money. And when you're spending that kind of cash, you really, really want every single dollar to count. According to this research, a lot of those dollars simply didn't. And here's maybe the biggest unintended consequence of them all. All that cash flooding the system at once contributed about 3 percentage points to the inflation that we've all been feeling. You can almost hear the whoops moment in the research. Sending so much money to so many people, a lot of whom didn't need to spend it right away, just helped pour fuel on the fire of rising prices. So the takeaway is pretty clear. It was incredibly expensive, inefficient, and it came with that inflationary sting in the tail. Okay, so if blanketing the entire country with cash isn't the best way to go, what is? Well, the answer lies in a really simple but incredibly powerful economic idea. It all comes down to understanding the fundamental difference between two types of people, the spender and the saver. Now, the fancy official term for this is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. I know, sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. All it means is this. If I give you an extra dollar, what are you most likely to do with it? Are you going to go out and spend it pretty much immediately? Or are you going to stick it in the bank or maybe pay down some debt? That simple question is the absolute key to unlocking a smarter stimulus. So let's break this down. On one side, you have people with a high MPC. These are typically your low-income folks, people on a fixed income. When they get some extra cash, it immediately gets spent on necessities. We're talking rent, groceries, gas for the car. It gets put right back into the economy. On the other side, you have people with a low MPC. These are usually higher income individuals. When they get an extra check, they're far more likely to save it, invest it, maybe pay off a credit card bill. That money doesn't really move. For a stimulus to actually work, you need spenders, not savers. It's that simple. So, how do you take this idea of MPC and turn it into an actual concrete plan? Well, this is where the study gets really exciting. It suggests a completely different strategy. Instead of small checks for everyone, it proposes larger, ongoing checks for a very, very specific group of people. And here it is. The proposal is for ongoing $2,000 monthly checks. But the most important word on this slide is only. These payments would be hyper-focused, going exclusively to those low-income, high-MPC individuals, the people who are guaranteed to put that money right back into circulation. It's like switching from a shotgun to a laser beam.
And the data on this is just crystal clear. The study found that when a high MPC person gets that $2,000, their spending is incredibly fast and predictable. About $1,600, that's 80%, is spent within the first 10 days. The rest of it is gone within a month. This is exactly what you want for economic stimulus. The money doesn't just sit there, it moves, it creates a ripple effect, paying for groceries, car repairs, new shoes for the kids, you name it. You know, it all just comes back to the original goal. The source material puts it perfectly. We're not looking for savers, we're looking for spenders. The entire point is to get money moving, to stimulate the economy. And to do that, you have to give it to the people who are actually going to spend it. It's right there in the name. So when you put it all together, you take the lessons from the past and you apply this logic of MPC, you end up with a proposal that the study argues is just better from every angle. It's smarter, it's cheaper, and it's way more effective. Let's just recap the huge advantages of this kind of targeted strategy. The advantages are pretty amazing when you lay them out. First, you get a much bigger bang for your buck, a greater stimulative effect because the money is actually spent, not hoarded. Because of that incredible efficiency, the total cost would be significantly less than that $850 billion program from before. But just as important, it sends meaningful, ongoing support directly to the people who are struggling the most, all while avoiding the waste of sending checks to people who just save it. It really is a win from every single angle. And that really leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? We've seen the flaws of the old model and the compelling logic of this new one. This idea of moving away from these broad, universal payments toward highly focused, targeted financial support, it could be a major turning point in how governments respond to economic crises. It really feels like a blueprint for a future where help isn't just more generous for those who need it most, but a whole lot smarter for the economy as a whole. You know, we hear all these huge economic headlines, but what do they actually mean for us, for our families? Today, we're digging into exactly that. What happens when massive government stimulus policies land right in your bank account? We're going to break down how it all translates into real-world impact and go way beyond the numbers you see on the news.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down for you. We'll start with those mind-boggling big numbers and funnel it down to a single household budget. Then we'll get into the human impact, see exactly where the money went, talk about making that impact stick, and wrap up with what it all means for policy that's really about people.
All right, let's dive right in. The main idea here is to connect the dots, between this massive, abstract government policy and the very real-world situation of paying your bills every month. So you turn on the news, right? And you hear these numbers, hundreds of billions, sometimes trillions of dollars. I mean, they're so huge they don't even feel real. It's a scale that feels totally disconnected from our day-to-day lives, almost like something out of a textbook, instead of a force that's actually shaping our communities. So, how do we bring these astronomical figures down to earth, to the conversations happening around the kitchen table? The real question is, how does a trillion-dollar policy turn into something that actually helps you cover rent, buy your groceries, or finally get the car fixed? That's where this story gets really personal and, frankly, really interesting. Okay, let's put a real number on this. During one of the stimulus rounds, a typical family of four could have gotten a single payment of $5,600. Now, for some people, that's a nice little cushion. But for millions and millions of families, a sum like this isn't just helpful, it was an absolute game changer that could completely reshape their finances for months to come. And look at what that money really means. Based on national averages, that $5,600 isn't just a number. It's almost 5 months of rent. That's housing security. It's 7 months of food on the table. It's over a year of keeping the lights on. All of a sudden, that one-time payment represents real, tangible stability. A moment to finally breathe. Okay, so having that financial breathing room is huge. But the impact, well, it goes way deeper than just balancing a checkbook. It has these profound personal effects on our actual well-being. And, the data is super clear on this. The relief isn't felt equally by everyone. For the most financially vulnerable groups, it was an absolute lifeline. Think about low-income households living paycheck to paycheck. That money got spent almost immediately on things they desperately needed. For seniors on a fixed income, it might have meant not having to choose between medication and food. For someone who'd lost their job, it was a bridge to finding new work. And for families with kids, well, it helped cover all those endless extra costs.
And this, right here, gets to the absolute heart of it. It's not just about the money, it's about mental and emotional health. Nearly 8 out of every 10 people said they felt less anxiety about paying their bills. That is a massive psychological shift. It's like a heavy weight just being lifted off their shoulders.
And that feeling of relief, it creates this incredible ripple effect through a person's entire life. When you're not in constant crisis mode, you sleep better, your mental health improves. We all know financial stress can strain relationships, so easing that burden can actually make families stronger. And since that chronic stress takes a physical toll, this relief can even lead to better health. People are just freed up to think more clearly and make better decisions for their future. So we know who benefited and how it made them feel. But where did all that money actually go? What did people spend it on? Looking at the spending patterns gives us this crucial insight into what people really needed in that moment. Well, the answer is pretty clear. Overwhelmingly, the funds went straight to the absolute essentials. The biggest piece of the pie went to things like housing, food, and utilities. The next biggest, paying down debt, especially that high-interest credit card debt that can trap families for years. After that, we saw people catching up on things they'd put off, like fixing a broken fridge or getting essential car repairs. And finally, some of it went into savings, building a small buffer for the next emergency. And this is so important to understand. The spending doesn't just stop with the person who got the check. It creates what you could call a personal multiplier effect. When you use that money to pay your rent, you're helping your landlord pay their mortgage. When you buy groceries, you're supporting that local store and its employees. That spending helps stabilize the entire local economy from the ground up. Of course, it's also true that a dollar isn't a dollar everywhere in the country, right? The same amount of money can have a wildly different impact depending on where you live. In a super expensive city like New York or LA, a $1,400 check might not even cover a single month's rent. It helps for sure, but its power is limited.
But in a rural town or a smaller city, that same amount could cover rent or utilities for several months, making it way more transformative for that family. All right, let's shift gears for a second and talk about something really crucial, the fact that these payments were temporary. A one-time cash infusion is incredibly powerful, but the real question for personal finance is how you turn it into something that lasts. We have to remember what these checks were designed to be. They were a temporary bridge, right? A way to get people through a really tough spot. They were never meant to be an ongoing, permanent solution. And understanding that is totally key to using the money in the smartest way possible. So, for a lot of people, the goal was to use this one-time boost to build a stronger foundation for the future. And that usually looks like one of three things. First, building an emergency fund. Even a small one can stop the next unexpected expense from becoming a full-blown crisis. Second, attacking high-interest debt, which frees up your money every single month moving forward. And third, investing in yourself. Maybe a training course or a certification that can boost your earning power for the long haul. So, after looking at all of this, the numbers, the spending, the personal strategies, what's the big takeaway here? What does it all add up to? You know, at the end of the day, you have to peel back all the layers of economic theory and political debate. Because behind every single one of these statistics, there's a human story. It's the story of a parent who can finally buy their kid the right school supplies. It's a senior who doesn't have to choose between their medicine and their groceries. It's a family that gets to stay in their home. And that really leaves us with one big question as we look to the future. We've seen just how powerful this kind of direct help can be. So, when the next crisis hits, and there will always be a next one, how do we build on these lessons? How can we design policies that aren't just effective on a spreadsheet, but are truly, deeply, and personally transformative for the people who need that help the most? That's a conversation we need to be having.
So, is another stimulus check on the horizon for 2025? Man, it's a question that's just swimming in rumors and speculation online. Today, we're going to cut through all that noise and give you the real, fact-based answers you're looking for.
All right, this is the big one, isn't it? It's the question that's on pretty much everyone's mind, and it's probably why you're here. So let's not waste any time. Let's just get right to it.
Okay, let's be crystal clear about this right from the start. As of right now, no new federal stimulus payment has been approved. I know you might see stuff floating around on social media, but the bottom line is Congress has not passed any new laws to send out more direct payments.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll start out the facts from the fiction. Then we're going to dive into the key economic numbers that lawmakers are watching. We'll also look at what it would actually take to trigger new payments. After that, we'll walk you through the whole process, from a bill to your bank account, and we'll wrap up with what you can do to be ready.
Okay, first things first, let's get a really clear picture of what's happening right now. It is so easy to get swept up in all the online chatter, so it's absolutely crucial to know the difference between what's official and what's just, well, noise. And this really is the key takeaway at the federal level. Congress hasn't passed a thing, but, and this is a really interesting twist, that isn't the whole story. You know, while the conversation in D.C. has pretty much stalled, the idea of direct payments is still very much alive in the states. I mean, we've seen places like New York, California, and Georgia all issue their own relief. So that tells you there's still a real appetite for this kind of support. It's just happening on a more local level for now.
So if nothing's happening, the big question is, why? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the economic data, the same numbers that lawmakers and economists are staring at every single day. These numbers are really the foundation for any decision, so let's get into them.
First, let's talk about jobs. Right now, the unemployment rate is sitting in the low 4% range. Now, historically speaking, that's considered pretty healthy. Sure, it's ticked up a little bit, but it is nowhere near the kind of distrust level that would normally have Washington sounding the alarm bells for emergency action.
And what about inflation? Remember when it felt like prices were just skyrocketing on everything? Well, things have cooled off a lot. Inflation is now down around 2.4%, which is way closer to the Federal Reserve's 2% target. This takes a lot of the urgency away because the economy isn't running red hot anymore.
And the overall economy? We look at something called the Gross Domestic Product, or GDP for that, and it's projected to grow just over 2%. Now, the most important part of that sentence is the word grow. The economy is expanding, not shrinking. We are not in a recession, which is almost always the starting point for this kind of massive stimulus.
This chart right here really puts it all into perspective. See that bar on the left? That's us right now, with unemployment around 4.2%. Now look at the bar on the right. That represents the historical danger zone.
that 6 to 7% level where Congress has traditionally felt like they have to step in and do something. You can see there's a pretty big gap between where we are today and a full-blown crisis.
Okay, so if the economy is chugging along, what could possibly change all this? What are the specific events or economic shifts that could suddenly put stimulus checks right back on the front burner in Washington?
You're going to want to keep an eye out for these 4 potential game changers. First, if unemployment starts climbing and crosses that 6% threshold we just talked about. Second, a huge drop in the stock market could totally wreck consumer confidence. Third, some kind of major geopolitical crisis or a massive natural disaster could send a shockwave through the economy. And finally, well, never ever underestimate election year politics. Stimulus checks tend to be pretty popular with voters.
You know, the whole debate is really complex, and there are good arguments on both sides. People who are for it will tell you that a lot of families are still really struggling, and that direct payments could stop a slowdown from becoming a recession. But on the other side, opponents will point to the stable economy and the gigantic national debt, and they'll argue that more stimulus would just pour gasoline on the fire of inflation.
So let's imagine one of those triggers actually happens. How does an idea for a check become actual money that you can spend? Let's pull back the curtain on that process. It's a long road with a lot of steps.
It all kicks off with the economic data. The numbers have to look bad enough for people to agree there's a problem. Then a member of Congress or the president proposes a bill. That bill has to fight its way through committees. If it survives, it goes to the full House and Senate for debates and votes. If, and that's a big if, it passes both, it finally goes to the president to be signed into law. Only then does the IRS get the green light for the final step, sending out the money.
And check this out. This timeline shows just how fast that last step can be. Once the political fight is over, the government has gotten incredibly good at this. The first big one, the CARES Act, took about 2 weeks. By the time the American Rescue Plan came around in 2021, money was hitting bank accounts within a week. The big takeaway here is that the system is built and ready to go fast, once a decision is actually made. So, with everything so up in the air, the best thing you can do is focus on what you can actually control. Really, the most important thing is just to be prepared, whether a stimulus payment ever shows up or not. Here are 4 simple, really practical steps you can take. First, go to the IRS website and make sure they have your current mailing address and direct deposit info. That is the #1 thing you can do to get paid quickly. Second, file your taxes every year, even if you don't owe anything. This keeps you in the system. Third, get your news from reliable sources and official government websites, not from some random post on social media. And finally, have a plan for what you do with the money, whether it's paying down debt or beefing up your savings. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground here. The current situation, the economic data, what could change things, the whole process. So after all that, what is the single most important thing you should walk away with? It's this. Any decision about future stimulus checks will be driven by cold, hard economic data, like unemployment and GDP, not by online rumors. So your best strategy isn't to just cross your fingers and hope for a check. It's to be prepared. Getting your financial house in order is always the smartest move, no matter what happens in Washington. And that brings us to one last, really big idea to chew on. After the massive government response to the pandemic, have direct payments like these become a permanent new tool in the economic toolbox? Is this something we should just expect now, every time the economy stumbles? That right there is the bigger question that's going to shape how we manage the economy for years to come. Today, we are going to tackle a huge question, one that I know is on a lot of people's minds, especially if you're on a fixed income. And that question is all about financial relief. Is more on the way? But to find the answer, we're not going to get bogged down in politics. Nope, we're going to follow the data, we're going to look at the history, and we're going to track the economic signals that tell the real story. All right, let's just jump right in. Is 2025 the year we finally see another stimulus check? Maybe for $2,000, maybe even more? I mean, let's be real, people are struggling. It's been a tough few years, and a lot of folks are looking for any kind of break they can get. So what's really going on? Are we going to see another big round of payments hit our bank accounts next year? You know, the funny thing is, the answer to that question has nothing to do with petitions or online chatter. Lawmakers don't just act because we ask them to. The real trigger, the thing that actually makes a stimulus payment happen, is 100% tied to the health of the U.S. economy. And once you grasp that connection, honestly, the whole picture gets a lot clearer. So let's break this down. There's a fundamental principle at play here. A kind of simple rule that dictates when the government decides to step in with this kind of major financial help. And it's actually a pretty predictable mechanism. That is, if you know what you're looking for.
I want you to picture a seesaw at a playground. On one side, you've got the strength of the economy. On the other side, you have the likelihood of a stimulus check. Now, when the economy is strong, it's booming, unemployment is low, companies are hiring, that side of the seesaw is planted firmly on the ground. The chance of stimulus? Very, very low. But what happens when the economy gets weak? When it starts contracting, unemployment starts ticking up, and you hear whispers of a recession? Well, that side of the seesaw goes way up in the air, which brings the stimulus side crashing down, making it way more likely.
This brings us to a concept called inverse correlation. Now, I know that sounds a little jargony, but the idea is super simple. When one thing goes up, the other goes down. They're opposites. A stimulus payment isn't a reward for a good economy. It's a rescue tool for a weak one. The government uses it when they think the economy is about to fall into a recession and it needs a jolt to get people spending again. This is probably the single most important thing to understand in all of this.
And look, this isn't just some theory. It is a clear, undeniable pattern that we have seen repeat itself every single time our economy has faced a major crisis, for more than 2 decades now. History really gives us a crystal clear roadmap here. Just think back over the last 3 major recessions. In 2001, the dot-com bubble burst. And what happened? Stimulus checks were issued. Fast forward to 2008, the housing market completely collapses, and it takes the entire economy down with it. The government's response? You guessed it, stimulus checks. And then, of course, in 2020, the pandemic shuts down the entire world, triggering a massive recession. And what did they do? Once again, stimulus checks. It's the same play every single time.
Let's look at the actual numbers. Back in 2001, after that tech bubble popped, the government sent out checks for $300. Now, at the time, that was seen as a pretty big deal to try and stabilize things.
Then we jumped to the massive financial crisis of 2008. The economic damage was just immense. So the government responded again, but this time the checks were for $600. Keep that number in your head. It doubled from the last recession.
And that brings us to 2020. The economy basically slammed on the brakes overnight. It was completely unprecedented. So lawmakers passed the CARES Act, and that very first stimulus check, it was for $1,200. Do you see it? That number doubled again from the 2008 amount.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Because when you put these numbers side by side, it's not just random. A very clear and kind of curious trend emerges. It's a distinct pattern of escalation.
I mean, the math here is it's incredibly straightforward. From $300 in 2001, it doubled to $600 in 2008. Then from $600, it doubled again to $1,200 in 2020. Every single time a major recession hits, that initial relief payment has doubled. That can't be a coincidence, right?
So naturally, this makes you ask the question, if this historical trend were to continue, what would the math suggest is next? Well, if you double $1,200, you get $2,400. Now, let me be perfectly clear. This is not a prediction. It's not a promise. It's simply an observation based on a very clear historical pattern. But it is a pretty interesting thought, isn't it?
Okay, so this all brings us to the most important question of all. If a weak economy is the trigger, what are the specific red flags we should be watching for right now as we head into 2025? Think of this as your personal toolkit for seeing what's coming down the tracks.
All right, these are the headlines you need to pay attention to. First, rising unemployment claims. This is the big one. It's a direct signal that businesses are hurting and jobs are being lost. Second, keep an eye on the Federal Reserve. When the Fed starts cutting interest rates like they began to do in September of 2024, it's their way of saying, uh-oh, things are slowing down too much. They're trying to give the economy a shot of adrenaline. And finally, just listen to the language on the financial news. When you hear words like softening, slowing, or contracting over and over again, those aren't just buzzwords. That's the consensus that the seesaw is starting to tilt.
And you have to remember, while the economic slowdown can feel kind of gradual, the actual shift into a full-blown crisis and the government's response can happen in the blink of an eye. Seriously. Just think back to early 2020. In February, most of us were living our lives completely normally. By March, everything was shut down. And by early April, stimulus checks were already starting to hit people's accounts. It can go from 0 to 100 in just a matter of weeks. It happens that fast.
So, the real takeaway here is this. Your best forecast isn't going to come from listening to politicians' promises or signing online petitions. It's going to come from you paying attention to those key economic signs we just talked about. The economy tells the real story long before any official announcement is ever made. The data, that's the real crystal ball.
So, as we wrap this all up, the picture becomes pretty clear, right? We have the seesaw rule. A weak economy triggers stimulus. We have the historical precedent. It has happened in every single major recession for the last 25 years. And we have that wild doubling effect in the amounts. History has basically drawn us a map, and it leaves us with one final provocative thought. The pattern seems to be set in stone. The only real question left isn't if it will repeat, but when.
You know, we've all been hearing the chatter about another stimulus check, but today we're going to dig into an argument that says maybe we're all asking the wrong question. What if the next round of aid wasn't for everybody, but was laser-focused on the people who truly needed the most? I mean, you see it all the time, right? Is another $1,400 check coming? It's the question, and for a lot of people, the hope that just doesn't seem to go away.
But the analysis we're looking at today completely flips that on its head. It stops asking if we should send out more money and starts asking a much sharper question: who should actually be getting it? And you know, that one little change shifts the entire conversation from just a universal handout to a really precise tool for helping people.
So let's start with the big idea here. The financial struggle in this country, well, it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, is it? We're not all in the same boat. So why would we all need the exact same lifeline?
And the argument laid out here is super direct. It says, look, sending a check to almost everyone is just not the most efficient way to solve the problem. The real power could come from a targeted rescue mission for those who are really, truly struggling right now. This whole thing really sets up a clear choice between two very different philosophies. So how does this targeted idea actually stack up against those big, broad stimulus checks we've all seen before? Let's break it down.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the way we've done things before. Broad, universal checks that went out to something like 85% of the entire population. And yeah, that came with a really high price tag, but on the other side, you have this proposed approach. It's focused, it's targeted, it goes only to low and fixed income folks, which means the cost is much, much lower and way more concentrated. It's basically the difference between casting a giant net and using a scalpel.
So, if we're going to get targeted, who exactly are we talking about? Who is in this group? Well, the analysis points to a pretty specific slice of the population that's facing the toughest financial battles.
The starting point is a number that's, well, it's kind of hard to ignore. 40 million. Right now, there are 40 million people in this country living in poverty. That is a staggering figure all by itself. But believe it or not, that 40 million is just the beginning. When you widen the lens just a little bit to include people who are very low income, you know, the ones living just a hair above the poverty line, that number explodes to about 100 million people. Let that sink in. That means for every 3 people you meet, one of them is struggling in a pretty significant way. All right, let's talk money, because when you actually run the numbers, the argument for being more targeted gets incredibly clear. So how do the costs really compare?
So check this out. To send a one-time $1,400 check to 50 million of the most vulnerable people, that would cost around $70 billion. If you expand that to the full 100 million people living in or near poverty, you're looking at about $140 billion. Now, I know, these are massive numbers, but context is everything here.
And here is where that context just becomes jaw-dropping. That targeted check for 50 million people, $70 billion. The last universal check that went out, a colossal $358 billion. The difference isn't just big, it's on a completely different planet.
Let me put that another way, because this is really the heart of the whole financial argument. For the price of that one universal check, you could send five separate checks to the 50 million people who need it the absolute most. Just imagine that. The potential for providing sustained, meaningful help is just, wow, it's on a whole other level.
But of course, anytime you talk about sending out billions of dollars, there's always that one huge question that hangs over the entire conversation, and that's inflation. What would this kind of spending actually do to the economy?
It's the critical question, right? Wouldn't pumping even $70 or $140 billion into the economy make prices spike for everyone? I mean, that's what a lot of folks think happened with the last few rounds of stimulus.
Well, the argument here is that it all comes down to how the money gets spent. People with low incomes are way more likely to use that money for immediate, essential needs. We're talking about groceries, keeping the lights on, paying for medicine, or just trying to pay down some debt. They're not running out to buy new TVs or book vacations.
So here's the crucial point. Because this money is going straight to essentials, to covering costs that already exist, it helps people stay afloat without necessarily overheating the whole economy. This analysis suggests the impacts on inflation would be negligible. That's a huge contrast to universal checks, which can definitely fuel widespread consumer spending and drive up prices.
And that really brings us to the final thought here. What we've walked through is a case built on some pretty simple math and really clear data. It suggests that by focusing our help where it's needed most, we could actually have a much bigger impact for a fraction of the cost. So the question it leaves us with is this: could this data-driven approach be the blueprint for how we handle economic support from now on?
So are we getting another stimulus check? Come on, it's the question that's on everybody's mind, right? Especially if you're on a fixed income. But what if I told you the answer isn't buried in politics? It's actually hidden in plain sight, in the economic data. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and find the one key trigger that actually makes these checks a reality.
This is the big one. It's the question we're all asking. After everything we've been through, it just feels like everyone is wondering when, or even if, more help is ever going to be on the way. Well, instead of just guessing, we're going to look at the exact same signals the people in charge are watching. It's time to see what might really be coming over the horizon.
Okay, so before we can look ahead, we have to get one really important thing straight. And, it might not be what you want to hear, but believe me, understanding this is the absolute most critical piece of the entire puzzle.
And here it is. The bottom line is, it doesn't matter how many petitions get signed or how loudly people demand more help, none of that directly triggers a stimulus check. The one thing, the only thing that acts as the catalyst is the health of the U.S. economy. Period.
Now look, I know that might sound a little discouraging at first, but it's actually the complete opposite. It's empowering. It means we can stop getting caught up in all the political noise and start looking at the real data, the same stuff the policymakers are looking at. It changes everything from just, hoping for help to actually understanding the conditions that make that help necessary.
So, if it's all about the economy, what are those conditions? What should we be looking for? Well, this brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today, the economic trigger. Let's break down exactly how this thing works.
The key idea here is something called an inverse correlation. Now, don't let the fancy term fool you. It's actually super simple. Just think of a seesaw, right? When one side goes up, the other side has to go down. It's the same here. When the health of the economy goes down, the chances of the government sending out stimulus checks goes up. They move in opposite directions. Simple as that. Think about it. When the economy is just humming along, jobs are everywhere, businesses are growing, there's basically zero chance of stimulus. And why would there be? You don't need to stimulate an economy that's already running hot. But when things start to slow down, when the economy looks like it's heading for a recession, that's when the whole conversation in Washington completely changes.
So what exactly should you be watching for? Well, here are the big 4 signals. First, rising unemployment claims. That's a big one. When more people are losing their jobs, it's a clear sign of trouble. Then you've got slowing growth and contracting business activity, which just means companies are making less and selling less. But honestly, the real flashing red light to watch for is the Federal Reserve. When they start cutting interest rates, you need to pay attention. They only do that when they see big trouble on the horizon and want to make it cheaper to borrow money to get things going again. These are the headlines that truly matter.
And look, this isn't just some theory somebody came up with. The data shows a crystal clear, repeating pattern throughout recent American history. It's kind of undeniable once you see it.
Let that sink in for a second. Every single major recession in the modern era has led to stimulus checks. That tells us that these payments aren't random acts of kindness. They're a standard, almost predictable response to a specific crisis, a major economic downturn. The playbook is there, and they've used it again and again.
Let's just walk through it. Back in 2001, the dot-com bubble burst, and we had a recession. The response? $300 checks. Okay. 7 years later, 2008, the housing market completely collapses, triggering a massive global crisis. The response? $600 checks. Then, of course, 2020, the pandemic shuts down the entire world. The response? $1,200 checks. Are you seeing the pattern here? A major recession hits, and boom, payments go out. It has happened every single time.
But hold on, because if we look just a little bit closer at those numbers, something even more interesting and kind of wild starts to pop out. It's not just that they sent checks, it's the amount of money that tells a whole other story. Okay, so the first time, in 2001, the baseline was set, $300.
Then in 2008, when the next big crisis hit, what happened? The amount exactly doubled to $600.
And in 2020, you already know where this is going. It doubled again to $1,200. I mean, come on, that's not a coincidence. That is a clear mathematical pattern playing out over 2 decades. Each payment was literally double the one that came before it.
All right, so now we're armed with the two biggest clues. We know about the economic trigger, and we've seen this incredible historical pattern. So, what can we reasonably guess about what might be coming next?
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we were to face another major recession in the near future, would the people in charge stick to this exact same doubling pattern that's held true for more than 20 years?
Well, if you just follow the math to its next logical step, you double $1,200 and you get $2,400. Now, let's be crystal clear about this. This is not a prediction. It's just pointing out a very curious historical trend. But it is a fascinating pattern to think about, isn't it? All of this really leads to one powerful, simple takeaway. If you want to have a real idea of what's coming, you can pretty much ignore the political shouting matches. The real answers are in the jobs reports, the GDP numbers, and what the Federal Reserve is doing. You now know exactly what to look for. The real signs that history shows us come right before these payments.
And here's one final crucial warning. When these things happen, they happen fast. I mean, think back to early 2020. In February, everything seemed pretty normal. By March, the entire world had changed. And by April, checks were already on their way. The shift from a stable economy to a crisis can happen in just a few weeks. When the dominoes start to fall, they fall quickly.
So, when you put it all together, history seems to show us that a major stimulus payment isn't really a question of if, but a question of when a recession forces the government's hand. The focus shifts away from waiting for politicians to make an announcement and toward watching the economy itself. So the real question I have for you is, now that you know what to look for, what economic signs will you be watching?
You know, there's a question that just keeps popping up, and I see it everywhere. Are we going to get a fourth stimulus check? It's a huge topic online, and honestly, for very good reason. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and really look at what the economy itself is telling us. So let's just get right to it. This is the question on everybody's mind. And listen, while there's tons of speculation out there, the real answer isn't buried in some political headline. Nope. It's found in the economic data. And that's not an exaggeration. We're talking about this today because for millions of people who are really feeling the financial squeeze, this isn't just some abstract idea. It's a very real daily concern. So let's try to get some real clarity. All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with what actually triggers these payments. Then we'll look at a pretty surprising pattern from the past. After that, we'll zero in on the one economic number you need to keep an eye on. And finally, we'll talk about why the next stimulus might look totally different from the last one. Okay, first things first. What actually causes a stimulus check to happen in the first place? It's not random, and it's not just politics. It is a direct, calculated response to one specific event, an economy that's gotten sick. And when we say the economy is sick, we're really talking about a recession. That's the official word for it, right? A major, widespread, and kind of prolonged downturn that hits everything and everyone, from big corporations to your local coffee shop. And this right here is the core idea we need to understand. If you just look back at the last couple of decades, the pattern is crystal clear. Every single major recession has been followed by stimulus checks. Every single time. It's basically become a standard move in the modern economic playbook. Here's a great way to think about it. Imagine the economy is a patient. A recession? That's when the patient gets seriously ill. The lawmakers are the doctors, and their go-to prescription is a big old injection of cash. That's the stimulus, to try and get the patient back up and running. And it makes sense, right? The sicker the patient, the bigger the dose of medicine they're going to need. So let's dig into that history a little bit, because when you actually examine the numbers from past recessions, well, a really fascinating and maybe even predictive pattern starts to show up. Okay, check this out. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the check was for $300. Then in 2008, during that massive financial crisis, it doubled to $600. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, it doubled again to $1,200. Are you seeing the pattern here? Now, if you just follow that doubling logic, the next number in that sequence would be around $2,400. But, and I have to be super clear about this is just an observation of a historical trend. It is absolutely not a guarantee. The actual amount of any future check would depend completely on how severe the economic downturn is at the time. So if a sick economy is the trigger, how do we know when it's sick enough for the doctors to step in? Well, there's one key health report that we can all look at. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it's simply called the jobs report. And inside this report, there are a few vital signs. You've got the headline number, the unemployment rate. But just as important is jobs created or lost. Are companies hiring, or are they laying people off? The labor participation rate tells us how many people are even trying to find a job. And average hourly earnings shows if our paychecks are keeping pace with inflation. Altogether, they paint a pretty clear picture of our economic health. So when you start to see that businesses, from the giant corporations all the way down to your local pizzeria, are slowing down their hiring, or worse, starting to let people go, that is a massive warning flare for the whole economy. It means people aren't spending as much, companies are getting nervous, and the whole economic engine is starting to sputter. That is the signal that gets lawmakers to scramble and start seriously talking about what they need to do. But, and this is really important, if they do act again, there's a good chance it won't be a carbon copy of last time. The whole strategy could shift to something much more targeted.
See, the last few checks were broad. They went out to a massive chunk of the population. A targeted strategy is different. It would focus laser-like on low-income and fixed-income households. Why? Because those are the folks most likely to spend the money immediately and pump it right back into the economy. This gives you way more bang for your buck, and it does it with less risk of driving up inflation for everybody else.
So the big takeaway here is this. We might need to adjust our expectations. If and when another stimulus package comes along, it could be designed very, very differently, maybe aimed at a smaller group of people to get the maximum economic impact with the fewest negative side effects. Okay, so let's just trace that path one more time. It starts with an economic contraction. We see it in those bad jobs reports. That triggers the lawmakers' scramble, where they have to respond. Then a stimulus package is passed, and finally, the payments are distributed with one single goal: to get spent right away and kickstart the economy. So that brings us to the final thought. Based on modern history, it really doesn't seem to be a matter of if the government will intervene in the next major recession. The real question is, how sick does the economy have to get before they open up that playbook once again? That's what we'll all be watching.
You know, remember those stimulus checks we all got a few years back? For some people, they were an absolute lifeline. For others, well, they were a nice little bonus. A really fascinating new study is asking a powerful question. What if we could have gotten a much, much bigger economic boost, but for a fraction of the cost? The answer, it turns out, lies in getting the money to the right people and doing it in a totally different way. So let's break down this idea for what might just be a smarter stimulus.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. The proposal this study makes is for a recurring $2,000 monthly check. But wait, this isn't some money for everyone idea. Not at all. The entire strategy really hinges on who gets this check, and the data suggests that being super precise is the key to making it all work.
So to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to walk through 4 key parts. First, we'll look back at the stimulus dilemma from 2020 and 2021. Then, we'll uncover a key economic clue that is absolutely central to this new idea. After that, we'll compare the economic impact of spenders versus savers. And finally, we'll explore all the details of this proposal for a smarter stimulus.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the stimulus dilemma. You know, to figure out where we might be going, we first have to really understand where we've been. So let's take a look back at the lessons we learned from that last big round of stimulus payments.
So between 2020 and 2021, the government pushed out 3 big waves of stimulus checks, and the total price tag? A pretty staggering $850 billion. I mean, that's more than the entire economy of some countries. The whole goal was to jumpstart our economy, but a price tag that big raises a really important question. Did that money actually get spent in the right places, or did we kind of miss the mark?
Well, here were the core problems with that old approach. The checks went out to about 85% of the population. That means a huge chunk of that money went to people who, frankly, didn't really need it for their immediate expenses. Economists have a name for this. They call it the helicopter approach, just kind of dumping money across the landscape and hoping for the best. And the result? Well, not only was it super inefficient, but some studies suggest it added about 3 percentage points to the inflation that came later. There just had to be a better way.
And that leads us right into our second section, a key economic clue. See, researchers who are analyzing all this data found a secret to making stimulus way more effective. And it all comes down to understanding one simple but really powerful economic principle.
That principle is called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. Now, don't let the name fool you. It sounds really academic, but it's an incredibly simple idea. It just measures one thing. When you get an extra dollar, how much of it do you actually spend and how much do you save? That's the whole concept right there.
Let's just boil it all the way down. Forget the jargon for a second. NPC is really just asking this one simple question. How likely are you to spend the next dollar you get? That's it. And this simple question, it turns out, is the key to unlocking a much more effective stimulus strategy.
So this concept basically creates two very distinct groups of people. You've got folks with a high MPC. They're typically on lower incomes, so an extra dollar is very likely to be spent immediately on necessities. Then you have people with a low MPC. They're usually on higher incomes, so that extra dollar is way more likely to be saved or invested. Simply put, the less of a financial cushion you have, the more likely you are to spend new money right away. And that distinction, well, it changes everything.
Okay, so let's move on to Section 3 and see how this all connects. Spenders versus savers. Now that we understand what MPC is, let's actually apply it. Let's follow the money and see what happens when we give the same amount of cash to people on opposite ends of that spectrum.
Let's use that core member from the study, $2,000. Now, imagine two of these checks are sent out. One goes to a spender, someone with a high MPC. The other one goes to a saver, someone with a low MPC. The amount of money is exactly the same, but where it goes next tells two completely different stories about the economy.
The data for the person with the high MPC is pretty striking. When this person gets that $2,000, the vast majority of it, about $1,600, is spent within just 10 days. The rest of it, gone within a month. This means the entire amount gets injected directly back into the economy, buying groceries, paying rent, supporting local businesses. This is stimulus in its absolute purest form.
And you know, this is the perfect time for a little reality check. The whole purpose of a stimulus check is right there in the name, to stimulate. It's not designed to be a savings plan or a debt reduction tool. Its only job is to get money moving through the economy, to keep everything going. Spending isn't a side effect of the program, it's the entire point.
So what happens when that same $2,000 check goes to a person with a low MPC, the saver? Well, the study found that they generally don't spend much of it at all. That money gets saved, or invested, or used to pay down a mortgage. From an economic stimulus perspective, that money is effectively taken right out of circulation. The source uses this great analogy. It's hoarded like a bunch of squirrels saving away nuts for the winter. And while saving is an amazing personal habit, it totally defeats the purpose of an economic stimulus. So the crucial point is this. When the whole goal is to kickstart the economy, the government isn't looking for savers. It's looking for spenders. It needs people who will take that money and immediately put it right back into the system. And this is why that distinction between high and low MPC isn't just some academic theory. It's the absolute key to making a program like this work.
And this brings us to our final section, a smarter stimulus. Based on everything we've just laid out, the study proposes a completely different, much more targeted approach for the next time a major economic downturn happens. So here's the proposed model. Step 1, instead of that blanket helicopter approach, you surgically identify only the high MPC individuals. Step 2, you replace the one-off check with a sustained monthly payment. And the result is this amazing 1-2 punch. You get way more economic stimulation for every single dollar you spend, and you avoid that massive $850 billion price tag of the old method.
The benefits of this kind of model are really clear. The money goes directly to the people who need it the most and who will actually go out and spend it. This gives you a much bigger economic bang for your buck at a fraction of the total cost. And maybe the biggest shift here is moving from that one-time payment to sustained support, replacing what one person called a payment that was cool for 3 minutes with a predictable lifeline that can last for months.
So this all brings us to the final question. This model suggests we can have a stimulus that is cheaper, more effective, and much more targeted to the people who need help. It's a really powerful idea, and it's backed by a lot of data. The real question is, when the next economic crisis hits, will policymakers stick with that old helicopter approach, or will they be willing to embrace a smarter, more precise strategy? What we learned from the last crisis might just be the key to navigating the next one.
You've probably seen the headlines buzzing around. Something about a new payment for Social Security recipients? Well, we're going to break down exactly what that's all about. It's a proposal that's getting a ton of attention, and we need to talk about what it could actually mean for millions of people. Okay, let's get right into it.
Okay, so the number at the absolute center of this whole conversation is this, $1,400. And look, this isn't just some random figure pulled out of a hat. It is the exact amount at the heart of a new proposal aimed squarely at people on Social Security.
So what is this really? Well, there's a pretty influential advocacy group called the Senior Citizens League, and they're the ones pushing for what they call a one-time catch-up payment. Now, the key thing to understand right away is that this is not a permanent monthly increase. Nope. It's designed as a special, one-shot payment to give folks some immediate relief.
But that leads to the big question, right? Why now? I mean, a proposal for a payment this big?
it doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's pointing to a much, much deeper problem that advocates say has been brewing for years. So let's dig into the why behind this whole thing.
And really, the entire argument. It all comes down to one thing: the cost of living gap. Basically, there's this growing sense that the money seniors are getting just isn't keeping up with what things actually cost day to day. And that gap is getting dangerous.
So to really get a handle on this gap, we've got to talk about COLA, the cost of living adjustment. It's that annual raise that Social Security recipients get. And its whole job, its only job, is to make sure your benefits can buy the same amount of stuff this year as they did last year, even when prices go up. On paper, it's supposed to be a perfect system.
But in the real world, is it working? Well, according to people like Shannon Benton from the Senior Citizens League, the answer is a big no. She talks about a sharp erosion in what people can actually buy. She's arguing that those yearly COLA raises just aren't keeping up with the soaring costs of essentials. We're talking food, housing, and a big one, healthcare.
And listen, this gap is a huge deal because of just how much people depend on these benefits. I mean, look at this. For almost 40% of folks, Social Security isn't just some of their income, it's all of it. It's their entire income. So for that group, when the COLA doesn't cut it, there's literally no other safety net. That's it.
Okay, so if we all agree the COLA isn't quite doing its job, the obvious next question is why? What's broken? And that question takes us right into the really technical, nerdy heart of this whole debate. It's all about a disagreement over the formula, the math used to figure out inflation for seniors.
Let's break this down, because it can get a little confusing. Right now, the COLA is calculated using something called the CPIW. Now, this index looks at what urban workers are buying. Things like gas for the commute, new clothes for the office. But here's the problem. Advocates say seniors spend their money completely differently. They spend way less on gas and way, way more on things like healthcare. So they want to switch to a different index, the CPIE, which is specifically designed to track spending for the elderly. It gives a lot more weight to those crucial costs.
And you might be thinking, is this just some niche idea? Not even close. When the Senior Citizens League actually surveyed retirees, the support for this change was just overwhelming. I mean, look at that number. A staggering 96% of the people they asked said, yes, the COLA should absolutely be based on how we actually spend our money. And the numbers behind that feeling are pretty grim. You've got 1 in 5 seniors spending over $1,000 a month just on healthcare alone. 4 out of 5 feel like the official inflation numbers are a joke and don't match what they see at the grocery store. And then there's this. 13% of seniors are trying to get by on less than $1,000 a month. That's often below the poverty line. It's a tough reality. So this idea of a one-time payment, it might sound kind of radical, right? But if you look back at our history, it's actually not a completely new concept. This whole conversation is really just the latest chapter in a long story of adjusting benefits when times get tough economically.
Yeah, I mean, this idea definitely builds on stuff we've seen before. Remember the Great Recession back in 2009? Social Security recipients got $250 checks then. And just a few years ago, there was a big push for a $200 a month increase. And of course, we all remember the stimulus checks, the economic impact payments during the pandemic. So you see, the idea of sending targeted direct cash, it's been done.
So history shows us it's possible, right? The government can step in and send direct help when things get bad. But, and this is a big but, it's really important to remember that just because it happened before doesn't mean it'll happen again. Every single proposal, including this one, has to fight its own battle through the current political and economic climate. Okay, so we've covered the what, the $1,400 payment, we've covered the why, the COLA gap, and we've looked at the history. Now let's pull it all together. Where does this proposal actually stand today? And, let's be honest, what are its chances of happening? You really have to understand how something like this becomes a reality. It's a journey. Right now, we are at the very beginning, steps 1 and 2. You have an advocacy group making a suggestion, and the media is talking about it. That's great. But for this to turn into actual money in someone's bank account, it needs to become a bill. That bill has to pass the House, and it has to pass the Senate. Then it has to be signed by the president. That is a very, very long and tricky road. All right, so let's boil this whole thing down. What are the most important things to remember? Number 1, and this is the big one, this is just a proposal. It is not a law. Number 2, it's designed for all Social Security recipients. That means retirement, SSI, and SSDI. 3, the whole argument is that the current COLA formula is broken because it doesn't reflect what seniors actually spend money on.
And finally, number 4, the fix they're suggesting has 2 parts. Change the formula for the future and give everyone a one-time payment to make up for the past. That's the whole shebang. And all of this really leaves us with a much bigger, more fundamental question to think about. I mean, this whole $1,400 idea, it's just one possible answer to a huge challenge. As our economy keeps changing and the cost of everything keeps changing, how do we make sure our most important safety nets, things like Social Security, are changing right along with it? That's the real conversation, and it's one we're definitely going to be having for a long, long time.
You know, if you try to keep up with the news about Social Security, wow, it's a lot. One minute you hear about benefit cuts, and the next it's all about increases. It can make your head spin, right? So in this explainer, we're going to slice through all that confusion. We'll get right to the facts, separating what's actually happening right now from what's just being proposed for the future. All right, let's just ask the big question right up front. Is Social Security sending you more money? Well, the answer's a little complicated. For some people, yes, and for others, it's still a big debate. There's one major change that's already law and has led to significant payouts for a specific group of people. For everyone else, there are other big ideas on the table. Our goal today is to show you exactly what's what.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today.
Now we're looking ahead to what's on the horizon. Let's dive into some other big legislative proposals that could mean more money for a lot more people down the road.
Right now, there are really 2 big ideas floating around for a future raise. On one side, you have the Social Security Expansion Act, a proposal from Senator Bernie Sanders. It's pretty straightforward. Give everybody on Social Security an extra $200 a month, and to pay for it, raise taxes on the highest earners. On the other side is a more targeted approach. The idea here is to send those extra checks only to the lowest income beneficiaries. The theory is that they're the most likely to spend that money right away, giving the economy a more immediate jolt.
And just to put that first idea into real numbers, an extra $200 a month comes out to $2,400 a year. That would be a serious increase for every single person receiving benefits. But, and it's so important to remember this is still just a proposal. It has not been passed into law.
Okay, let's shift gears completely. There's a whole other vision for how to improve Social Security, and this one has nothing to do with passing new laws for benefit raises. Instead, it's all about making the system stronger from the inside out through better management and different tax policies. And you can really see this viewpoint summed up in this quote from former President Donald Trump. He says, "I signed one big, beautiful bill and allowed no tax on Social Security for our great seniors." So for this approach, the key isn't necessarily bigger checks from the government, but letting seniors keep more of the money they already have by cutting taxes on their benefits.
So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground and some very different ideas for what's next. Let's try to pull this all together and figure out, what does this all mean for the future of your benefits? Okay, so when you boil it all down, there are really 3 distinct paths we've looked at. First, you have the Fairness Act. The status on that one is confirmed law, and it's already providing back pay and raises for that specific group affected by WEP and GPO. Then you have the 2 big future ideas. There's the legislative path, passing new laws to raise monthly checks for lots of people, and then there's the administrative vision, which is all about strengthening the system from within through efficiency and tax cuts.
And really, that brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? Bigger checks versus a stronger system. What's the right path forward? Should the main goal be getting more money into people's pockets every month to deal with the rising cost of living? Or should the priority be on creating a more efficient, streamlined, and fiscally sound system for the long haul? There's no easy answer, but whatever we decide will define the future of Social Security for tens of millions of Americans.
Today, we are really getting into the weeds on the future of supplemental security income, SSI. There are some huge proposals out there that could completely change the game for millions of people. We're talking bigger monthly checks and a massive jump in how much you're allowed to save. But when you peel back all the layers, all these proposals really come down to one single critical question. Is SSI, as it stands today, actually keeping up with the cost of living? This is the core problem we're going to unpack, because for almost 8 million people, the answer to that question really dictates their entire life. So let's just step back for a second. SSI was created, over 50 years ago, and it had a super clear mission: to be a financial safety net. It was designed to fight poverty, and for a while, it did its job. But over the years, a gap started to appear, and that gap has just kept growing, leaving the whole program and the people who rely on it falling further and further behind. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, what exactly is SSI?
It's a really important federal program run by the Social Security Administration that gives a monthly income to adults and kids with disabilities, and also to folks 65 and older who have very little in terms of income and resources. And this right here is the absolute key to its original design. The whole idea from day one was that the payments would keep people right at the federal poverty line. Not way above it, sure, but definitely not below it. It was supposed to be a floor, a baseline of financial stability. And remembering that original goal is so important for understanding where things are today. So this idea of falling behind, it isn't just a feeling. It's not a hunch that things are getting tougher. It is a measurable, quantifiable gap. And the numbers, well, they tell a really, really clear story about the difference between the program's original promise and today's reality. Okay, let's start with the benchmark. For 2025, the official federal poverty line for one person is $15,650 a year. But nobody pays their rent once a year, right? So let's break that down by month. That comes out to $1,304. Remember that number. It's our baseline. Now let's look at what's actually happening for someone on SSI. The absolute maximum federal payment a single person can get in 2025 is $967 a month. That's the ceiling. You can't get a dollar more from the federal government. So right off the bat, you can see those two numbers are not the same. And when you put those two numbers right next to each other, like in this chart, wow, the gap just jumps right out at you. It's not even close. The maximum benefit falls way short of that poverty line, and this difference has just been getting worse year after year. So do the math. The difference is $337. That's the hole people find themselves in every single month. To put it another way, the maximum SSI check is nearly 35% below the very poverty line it was created to meet. That is a massive gap to cover when you're on a fixed income. Okay, so that's the problem. It's a big one. But how do you fix it? Well, there are some pretty concrete plans being floated around. And maybe the biggest one is a piece of legislation called the SSI Restoration Act. It's designed to attack that income shortfall we just talked about head on.
And this proposal is getting a lot of attention. In the source material we looked at, one analyst put it pretty bluntly, saying the SSI Restoration Act, in my opinion, is a really, really good one. It checks literally all the boxes. So it's seen as this complete fix, not just some tiny little patch.
So what are these boxes that it checks? Well, first and foremost, the Act wants to raise monthly benefits to 100% of the federal poverty line. That means, boom, an instant $337 a month raise for someone getting the max benefit. And this part is crucial. It would then tie or index those benefits so they automatically go up with the poverty line every year. That way, this gap can never open up again. The Act also tackles the marriage penalty, which can hurt married couples, and it wants to seriously raise those ancient asset limits, which we're going to talk about next. Okay, reality check time. This is really, really important to understand. The SSI Restoration Act is still just a proposal. Right now, it has not been passed by Congress. It's been introduced, it's being talked about, but it is not the law of the land. But, a bigger check is only half the story. There's another huge problem that's kind of baked into the system right now, and it has everything to do with saving money. Okay, so the asset limits for SSI, that's how much money you can have saved up, are stuck in a time warp. They haven't been updated in decades. Right now, the limit for one person is just $2,000. I mean, think about that. Your car breaks down, your fridge dies, you have one unexpected medical bill, that can wipe you out completely. It basically makes it impossible to build any kind of real safety net. So the proposed fix for this is, well, it's dramatic. The asset limit for an individual would jump from $2,000 all the way up to $10,000. And for a couple, it would go from $3,000 to $20,000. I mean, that is a night and day difference. Let's just pause on that individual number for a second. Going from $2,000 to $10,000, that's a 500% increase. We are not talking about a small tweak here. This is a massive shift in policy, basically admitting that the financial world of today is nothing like it was when these old limits were set. And what does that really mean for someone's life? It's not just about the numbers. It's about security.
It's about having that peace of mind that comes from knowing you have a rainy day fund. It means you could actually save for an emergency without that constant fear of losing the very benefits you need to survive.
Okay, so we've got these two huge ideas on the table, one to boost monthly income and one to raise the savings limit. But what does it all mean? How does a plan like this go from being an idea to being a reality?
Well, it all comes down to the process in Washington. First, lawmakers have to introduce the bills, which, yep, they've already done. After that, the bills have to get debated in committees and then eventually get voted on by both the House and the Senate. If, and that's a big if, a bill passes, then it goes to the Social Security Administration to actually put the changes into effect. But it's key to remember where we are right now. These are all still just proposals on paper. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of the whole shebang. We're talking about 4 big things. 1, bigger checks with that $337 monthly boost to get up to the poverty line. 2, higher savings with that 500% jump in the asset limit. 3, fairer rules, getting rid of that penalty for married couples. And 4, future-proofing the system by tying benefits to the poverty line so this whole mess never happens again. When you step back and look at it, these proposals are really a total rethinking of what SSI is and what it does. They're trying to bring it back to its original promise of being a real anti-poverty safety net. But the million-dollar question remains, is there enough political will to make these big plans a new reality for the millions of Americans who rely on it? And that's what we'll all be watching.
Okay, let's talk about a pretty wild idea. What if every single person on Social Security got the exact same check every month? I mean, not based on how much you earned during your career, but just one flat amount for everyone. It's a really radical proposal, and it's starting to get some serious attention because it would completely transform one of the country's most important programs. So let's dive in and really unpack what this is all about.
Right now, the system is the complete opposite of flat. It's all over the place. You've got some folks on one end getting as little as, say, $50 or $60 a month, and then on the other extreme, the maximum possible benefit is over $5,000. That is a gigantic gap, and it's really the core issue that's fueling this whole conversation.
So, before we can really get the logic behind this flat benefit idea, we've got to first understand this huge divide in the current system. It's kind of like a tale of 2 different programs.
And look, this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This disparity has very real, very human consequences. Right now, there are about 11 million seniors in the U.S. living below the federal poverty line, and a lot of them depend on Social Security. That one number alone just shows you how high the stakes are here.
Yeah, that maximum benefit, the one around $5,000, it gets a lot of attention. But the reality for most people, it's nowhere close to that. The average retirement benefit is actually just under $2,000. And if you're on disability, SSDI, the average is even lower, just a bit under $1,600. So this chart really shows you the vast majority of people are a long, long way from that top payment.
This quote from one of the sources we looked at just hits the nail on the head. It talks about this massive bifurcation. And that's exactly what it is, a system split in 2, where some people are getting just a few dollars, while others are getting thousands. This is the problem the flat benefit idea is trying to solve.
So what's the big idea to fix this divide? Well, it's to completely flatten the whole system, to create one single universal benefit amount that every single qualified person would get every single month.
And the number that's being talked about is around $2,200 a month. Now that number wasn't just picked out of a hat. It's what they've calculated as the equilibrium point, the spot where the high-end and low-end benefits would eventually meet in the middle.
So how would we even get there? I mean, you can't just flip a switch overnight. The whole idea is that it would be a gradual process. You'd be systematically raising the payments for people at the bottom, while at the same time, you're slowly lowering the payments for people at the very top until everybody eventually lands on that same flat number.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a massive, complicated undertaking. So how would a change this huge actually work in practice? Let's get into the mechanics.
It really breaks down into about 4 main steps. First, you start to phase down those high-end benefits over several years. A really key part of this is step 2. You'd stop giving the annual cost of living adjustments, the COLAs, to the highest earners. Step 3, all the money you save from that gets rerouted. And finally, step 4, you use those funds to boost up all the low-end benefits until they hit that target equilibrium point.
Now, a really big piece of this whole debate is the timeline. How long would this take? Is it a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, maybe even 15 years or more? The source material shows there are different schools of thought on this. And it matters because the longer the timeline, the higher that final flat benefit is likely to be, just because of inflation and economic growth over time.
And there are a couple of different ways to actually bring those high-end benefits down. One idea is a simple annual deduction. You just trim their benefit by, say, 5% each year. The other, maybe a slightly gentler way to do it, is to just freeze their benefits by taking away their yearly COLA. That means their payment just wouldn't keep up with inflation anymore, and its real value would slowly decrease.
You know, if a plan like this actually happened, it would be so much more than just a tweak to payment amounts. It would fundamentally change the entire purpose and identity of Social Security as we know it.
What this would do is basically turn Social Security into something that looks a lot like a guaranteed basic income, or GBI. And the idea behind a GBI is pretty simple. Everyone who qualifies gets the same recurring payment. It creates a true financial floor that no one can fall beneath.
And this really gets to the philosophical heart of the whole thing. It would shift Social Security from being an earned benefit, where what you get out is tied to what you put in, to a system of universal support, where you get the benefits simply because you're a qualified citizen or resident. It's a huge change in thinking.
The potential results here are pretty massive. I mean, on the one hand, a move like this could lift millions of seniors and people with disabilities out of poverty. It would give them a stable, predictable income. It would also make the super complex Social Security formulas way, way simpler. But maybe most importantly, it forces us all to have a conversation about what we want Social Security to be in the 21st century.
Let's just boil it all down and put these two systems side by side. Right now, your benefit is based on your earnings history. In the new proposal, it's based on just being a citizen or resident. The benefit amount goes from totally variable to completely flat, and the main goal of the program itself actually shifts from replacing your income to preventing poverty, period.
So when you get right down to it, this whole debate makes us ask a really fundamental question about one of our most important institutions. Should Social Security be an earned benefit that you're entitled to based on your work, or should it be a guaranteed safety net for absolutely everyone? How we answer that question will really define its future.
Today, we're jumping into a really interesting idea that could totally change how we look at financial support, especially when times get tough. It's all about asking, is there a smarter way to help people out? I mean, you feel it, I feel it, we all feel it, right? The price of just about everything seems to be going up and up. It puts a real squeeze on your wallet, and that leads us to a huge question. With costs climbing like this, is there a better, more intelligent way to provide some relief?
And that right there is the heart of the problem. We've all seen prices jump, but for a lot of people, especially folks on Social Security or other fixed incomes, the money coming in just isn't keeping up with the money going out. So we're going to look at one idea that's designed to fix that exact problem.
So what is this new idea all about? Well, because of all the economic challenges we've seen, experts are talking about a pretty major shift in how we handle this stuff. It's a much more targeted approach, and it's really different from what we've done in the past.
The big number at the center of this whole proposal is $2,000. And no, not just as a one-off payment, but as a regular monthly check. This is the number that supporters think could offer some real, consistent help.
Okay, so how would this thing actually play out? Well, the idea is for these ongoing monthly checks, but, and this is the key difference, they wouldn't go to everybody. They'd be aimed specifically at low and fixed income households. The whole goal is to give them immediate spending power to help them cover that gap that inflation has created.
But why do it this way? Why only target certain people? Well, it all boils down to the economics of how different people spend their money. And honestly, this is where the whole proposal gets really fascinating.
The key concept has this really fancy-sounding name, the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. But don't let the name fool you, it's actually super simple. All it means is, when you get an extra dollar, how much of it do you spend and how fast do you spend it? This one idea is crucial to understanding the entire plan.
And when you look at the studies on this, it's pretty wild. When a lower income household gets a $2,000 payment, they spend about 80% of it, that's $1,600 in the first 10 days. The rest of it, gone within the next month. That super fast spending is exactly what economists mean when they say someone has a high MPC.
And this just lays out the big difference, right? People with a high MPC, who are usually on lower incomes, spend new money almost immediately, often because they have to, for necessities. On the flip side, folks with higher incomes, the low MPC group, are way more likely to save it, invest it, or pay off debt. That money doesn't get pumped back into the economy nearly as fast, if it even does at all. So this brings us to a really important comparison. To really get why this new targeted idea is even on the table, we've got to look back at those big stimulus checks that went out in 2020 and 2021 and kind of learn from what happened. The difference between these two plans is just night and day. The old stimulus went to about 85% of everyone. And look, the intention was good, but the absolutely massive cost was a big factor in the inflation we're all dealing with now. This new proposal is meant to be the exact opposite. Surgically targeted, way less expensive, and designed to give a focused boost to the economy without causing prices to spiral.
Okay, let's really zero in on that cost difference, because the numbers here tell you everything you need to know about why this new strategy is being considered.
Those widespread stimulus checks from a few years back, they cost around $850 billion. Just think about that number for a second. It's a staggering amount of money to push into the economy all at once. Now compare that to the estimate for this new targeted idea. Giving 3 monthly checks of $2,000 to about 50 million people would cost around $100 billion. That's less than an eighth of the cost for what's argued to be a more direct and sustained impact.
So what does that really mean in practice? It means for a tiny fraction of the costs, this plan could give more consistent, ongoing help directly to the people who need it, all while trying to avoid that big inflationary wave that ends up hurting everybody in the long run.
And all of this leads to what a lot of the experts behind this idea are calling the win-win argument. It's a vision for a more focused, more efficient, and you could argue a fairer way to handle economic relief in the future.
So the argument really is that it's just a smarter way to do things. You're getting money straight to the people who will actually spend it, which gives you a much better bang for your buck in terms of stimulating the economy. And by learning from the past, the goal is to be more cost-effective and a lot fairer, especially to those whose incomes have fallen behind. And in the end, it really does come back to this simple quote. The whole point of a stimulus check is for people to spend it. I mean, that's why it's called a stimulus. Giving it to people who are just going to park it in a savings account doesn't really achieve that goal. Giving it to the folks who'll spend it right away absolutely does.
Which, of course, leaves us with that one big question. When you look at the lessons from the past, and you follow the economic logic we've just walked through, could this kind of targeted approach be the future of financial relief? It's definitely a powerful idea to think about.
Today, we're diving into some really big proposals that could change the monthly benefits for millions of people who receive Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. All right, let's start with this number. For 2025, the absolute maximum federal SSI benefit for a single person is $967 a month. That's the ceiling, the most anyone can get from the program each month. And that brings us to the big question, right? With the cost of everything these days, rent, food, you name it, a lot of people are asking if that amount is really enough to get by.
So to really get what these proposals are all about, we first have to understand the problem they're trying to fix. And it really all comes down to a growing financial gap between SSI benefits and the official poverty level.
You know, it's interesting. When this program was created more than 50 years ago, the whole point was to act as a safety net, to keep people right at the federal poverty line. But over the decades, well, it's fallen behind.
And this chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the max SSI benefit at $967. On the other, the 2025 federal poverty line, which is $1,304. You can literally see the gap right there. And that difference comes out to $337. Every single month. That's the shortfall. And that number is at the absolute heart of this whole debate. You can really feel the urgency in this quote from our source material. I mean, that's pretty powerful language, and it just shows how strongly some people feel that the system needs to be modernized to close that gap.
Okay, so we've seen the problem. Now, what are the proposed solutions? Well, the first big one is a piece of legislation aimed squarely at closing that financial gap we just looked at.
It's called the SSI Restoration Act. You can basically think of it as a big package of updates trying to modernize parts of the program that, frankly, haven't been touched in decades. The single biggest, most significant change in this act would be to raise the maximum monthly benefit to match the federal poverty line. The goal is to get the program back to doing what it was originally intended to do.
So remember that $337 gap? This would close it. For someone getting the maximum benefit, this would mean a direct increase of $337 a month.
bringing their total from $967 up to that poverty line figure of $1,304. Now, this is absolutely critical to understand. This is a proposal. It's being discussed, but it has not been passed by Congress. It is not current law. Okay, so the next big proposal tackles another part of the program that critics say is seriously out of date, the super strict limits on how much money a person can have in savings.
These limits on assets, they haven't been updated for inflation in decades. This makes it almost impossible for people to save up even a small emergency fund for, a car repair or an unexpected bill.
And the proposed change here is huge. The asset limit for a single person would jump from the current $2,000 all the way up to $10,000. And for married couples, the increase is just as dramatic. It would go from that long-standing $3,000 limit to a proposed $20,000. To put that in perspective, for an individual, that's a 500% increase in how much they'd be allowed to save without being penalized or losing their benefits.
So, with such significant changes on the table, the natural question is, okay, what's the holdup? What's the current status of all this in Congress?
So just to sum it all up, the SSI Restoration Act is really this bundled package of reforms. It's trying to raise the benefits to the poverty line and also massively increase those savings limits, tackling the two major issues we've just covered. And this brings us to the bottom line. As of today, August 16th, 2025, the SSI Restoration Act has not passed. It is still just a proposal.
So that leaves us with a final thought for this explainer. When you look at that documented gap between the benefits and the poverty line and the fact that these rules haven't been updated in decades, it really makes you wonder, what level of priority should reforming SSI have on the national agenda?
There's a number that's been making a lot of noise lately. A number that could mean an extra $2,400 a year for every single person on Social Security. It's a huge proposal, sparking a ton of hope, but also a pretty fierce debate. So today, we're going to dig in and find out what's really going on.
You've probably seen the headlines, right? The posts on social media, the chatter online, a $2,400 boost to your annual Social Security check. But is this a real possibility we should be paying attention to, or is it just, political noise? Let's try to separate the facts from the fiction here.
Okay, so first things first. Let's talk about the promise itself. We need to break down these numbers that have grabbed everyone's attention and figure out what they could actually mean for millions of American retirees.
So, the big number at the heart of this whole thing is $2,400. That's the proposed annual increase that every Social Security recipient would see in their pocket. And let's be honest, in a time when the cost of everything from gas to groceries seems to be going up, a figure like that, well, it's no wonder it's capturing the public's imagination.
Now, what does a big annual number like that actually mean for your day-to-day life, for your budget? Well, if you break it down, it comes out to an extra $200 every single month. For a lot of folks, that's not just some small bonus. That could be a game changer. That could be the difference needed to cover utility bill, afford prescriptions, or just have a little more breathing room without all that financial stress. It's that monthly figure that makes this proposal feel so real and so appealing.
So where did this idea even come from? It's not just a number somebody pulled out of thin air. It's actually rooted in a formal piece of legislation that's making its way through Washington, D.C. right now.
The whole proposal comes from a bill called the Social Security Expansion Act. This is the official legislation that's been introduced in Congress, and its main goal is to make this increase a reality. And that's a really key point. This isn't just a talking point, it's a defined proposal with a very clear objective: boost benefits by $200 a month.
Of course, this immediately brings up the biggest question you can ask with any new spending. Who's going to pay for it? Well, the proposal's answer is to adjust the Social Security payroll tax cap. Right now, there's a ceiling on how much of a person's income gets taxed for Social Security. This act would raise that cap, or maybe even get rid of it altogether. That means high-income earners would end up contributing on a much, much larger portion of their earnings. As you can probably guess, this is one of the most controversial parts of the whole plan.
To really get a feel for the real-world impact, just look at the average person receiving benefits. Right now, their monthly check is around $1,800. With this boost, it would jump up to $2,000. That's about an 11% increase, which is pretty significant. And what this chart doesn't even show is that for people who are on minimum benefits, the impact would be proportionally even bigger. We're talking potentially life-changing.
Okay, so now we have to make a big shift from talking about what the proposal is to whether it could ever actually happen. Because while the idea of an extra $2,400 a year sounds fantastic, its path to becoming law is, to put it mildly, filled with some major political and economic roadblocks.
Yeah, the road to this becoming a law is incredibly steep. I mean, first, politically, it's facing just deep divisions in Congress. Fiscally, it runs headfirst into some really serious concerns about the long-term health of the entire Social Security system. And then you've got the logistical side, potential delays, these really complex questions about fairness between generations, and even unknown ripple effects on other government benefits. It's a lot to tackle.
Let's just break down the debate a little. On one hand, supporters argue, pretty passionately, that this boost is absolutely essential to help seniors keep up with the rising cost of living. They also say, hey, putting more money into the hands of 70 million people, that would be a huge stimulus for the economy. But on the other side, you've got critics raising all sorts of alarms. They're saying it's fiscally irresponsible, and they're worried that injecting billions of dollars into the economy could actually fuel inflation. They also bring up that concern that it puts an unfair financial burden on younger generations who have to foot the bill. It's also really important to manage our expectations about timing. Even in the absolute best-case scenario, the journey from a proposal to an actual payment in your bank account is a long one. A bill gets introduced, then it faces this lengthy, often really contentious debate in Congress. It would almost certainly be changed and modified through compromises. Only after all of that, maybe, it gets approved. And even then, implementation would probably be phased in over time. The big takeaway here? No one should expect to see an extra $200 in their check anytime soon.
And you know, this quote from the source material really gets to the heart of the matter. This whole conversation we're having about a $2,400 boost is really a symptom of a much larger issue. The Social Security system as a whole is facing a crisis, and it desperately needs reform. The question isn't just about this one proposal, it's about how we're going to ensure the entire system stays solvent for our kids and grandkids.
Okay, so with all this uncertainty floating around, what does any of this mean for your own financial planning? Let's step beyond the headlines for a minute and focus on what you can actually control. This is such a fundamental point, and it often gets lost in these kinds of debates. It's really worth remembering that when Social Security was first created, it was designed to be one part of a three-legged stool for retirement, right alongside personal savings and pensions. It was never ever meant to be the only source of income for retirees. And keeping that context in mind is absolutely essential for responsible financial planning.
Relying on political promises is a really risky strategy for something as critical as your retirement. Taking proactive control of your own financial security, that is the most reliable path forward, no matter what happens in D.C.
You go online and it seems like everyone is talking about one thing. Is a fourth stimulus check on the way? Well, the real answer, it turns out, isn't a simple yes or no, and it's definitely not a date on a calendar. Today, we're going to dig in and figure out what actually needs to happen for another check to even be a possibility. Okay, so this is it, right? This is the big one, the question on everyone's mind, and it's especially critical if you're on a fixed income, Social Security, SSDI, VA benefits. That hope for another payment is really, really strong. But to get a real answer, we've got to look beyond the headlines and get a handle on the economic reality of the situation. And honestly, this is the most important idea to grasp. A stimulus check isn't some scheduled payment. It's not a holiday bonus. It's an emergency tool, like a fire extinguisher in a glass case. Lawmakers don't just wake up one day and decide to send out money. Something major has to happen to force their hand. So the question isn't when, it's why. And that why? It's all about the health of the U.S. economy. So what are these big economic triggers? If you look back, every major stimulus payment we've ever gotten has been a reaction to a crisis. It's never proactive. So to figure out what might be coming, we have to learn to watch the same economic vital signs that the folks in Washington are looking at. I love this analogy because it makes it so clear. When the economy, our patient, is healthy and doing well, you don't give it medicine, right? Of course not. But when it gets sick, when it slides into a recession, that's when lawmakers reach for the medicine cabinet. And that stimulus is the dose they use to try and get things moving again. The sicker the patient, well, the bigger the dose of medicine. Now, of all the vital signs they check, the job market is, without a doubt, the most critical. It's the big one. See, when people are working, money is flowing, the economy is humming along. But the second you see widespread layoffs and rising unemployment, that is a massive flashing red flag that the entire system is in trouble. That's the one thing that gets everyone's attention. And the way we measure this is with something called the official jobs report. You might hear it on the news as the non-farm payroll report. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it gives us this incredibly detailed picture of what's happening with jobs all across the country.
So what's actually in this thing? Well, first, it's got the national unemployment rate. Is it going up, down? That's huge. Then it tells us exactly how many jobs were created, or, and this is the scary part, how many were lost that month. It even looks at average hourly earnings. Are people's wages growing, or are they stuck? And finally, the labor force participation rate. Basically, what percentage of Americans are actually working or trying to find work? If you see all these numbers turn negative and stay negative for a few months in a row, that's the clearest sign that our patient is getting sick.
And this isn't just some abstract theory. If we look back at recent history, there's an undeniable pattern. Major economic problems have been followed consistently by stimulus payments. It's like a playbook they've used over and over again. Just look at this timeline. It lays it out perfectly. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the government sent out $300 checks. Then you fast forward to 2008, the huge housing crisis, the Great Recession. That amount doubled to $600. And then, of course, 2020. The pandemic shuts down the entire world economy, and that first check was $1,200. See the trend? Every single time a massive economic crisis was followed by cash payments directly to the people. You see it, right? It's not just that they sent checks. Look at the amounts. From $300 to $600, it doubled. From $600 to $1,200, it doubled again. Now, look, history isn't always a perfect predictor, but that's a pretty interesting trajectory. It suggests that with each new crisis, lawmakers felt the need for a bigger and bigger dose of that economic medicine. So, does this mean the next check would automatically be $2,400? Well, not so fast. This is just us looking at a historical pattern. It's pure speculation. Any future amount would depend entirely on how bad the next crisis is. A mild recession might only call for a small check, but a really deep economic collapse, a number like this could definitely be on the table. The size of the check is always tied to the size of the problem. And that brings us to another really critical idea. It's not just about how much money, it's about how it's sent out. See, the last few rounds of checks went to something like 85% of all Americans. But there's a growing argument that maybe, just maybe, that broad shotgun approach isn't the smartest way to do it. Let's compare these two ideas. Broad relief, that's what we're used to, goes to almost everybody. The problem is, a lot of people who get it don't really need it, so they save it. That doesn't help the economy, and it can actually push inflation higher. The other idea is targeted relief. This would focus the money only on low and fixed income folks, the people who are guaranteed to go out and spend it right away on necessities. This gives you way more bang for your buck with less risk of inflation. It could even mean multiple smaller payments over time instead of just one big one. And that is the absolute fundamental truth of all of this. We have to remember this. A stimulus check is not meant to be a contribution to your savings account. The entire purpose, the only purpose, is to get you to spend it. They want that money flowing through stores and businesses immediately. Buying food, paying bills, getting your car fixed. That spending is the jolt of electricity the economy needs to snap out of a recession. Okay, so let's put this all together. Instead of listening to rumors online, here's a clear, simple dashboard of what you should actually be watching for. These are the real signals. Think of it as a three-step domino effect. First, you'd see the warning signs. That monthly jobs report would start showing really bad numbers. Month after month, job losses, unemployment taking up a lot. Second, after enough bad data, the experts would make it official. We are in a recession. And third, it's only then, when the crisis is real and undeniable, that you'd see lawmakers in Congress finally scramble to put a stimulus package together, which would probably include direct payments.
So, the bottom line, the most crucial takeaway from all of this is this. Right now, with the economy as it is, a fourth stimulus check just isn't happening. The trigger isn't an online petition, it's not a politician's promise. The only trigger is a real, measurable, and significant economic crisis, one that's bad enough to force Congress to act. Understanding this lets you see past all the noise and know exactly what to look for.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about.
we've seen the stimulus playbook change over time, right? The amounts got bigger, and now we're talking about new, more targeted strategies. So as our economy keeps evolving and faces new and different challenges, how will the government's medicine have to adapt to actually keep working? Something to think about.
If you're one of the tens of millions of Americans who get Social Security, there's a new proposal making some serious waves that you really need to hear about. An advocacy group is pushing hard for a pretty significant, one-time payment for everybody who gets benefits. So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what this proposal is, why it's even on the table right now, and what it could all mean for you.
So let's just cut right to the chase. The number at the very heart of this whole conversation is $1,400. Now, this isn't some new monthly increase or a tiny adjustment we see every year. Nope, this is a proposal for a single, direct payment. The whole point is to provide some immediate financial relief. It's a pretty big number, and it's meant to tackle a financial strain that, according to proponents, has been building up for years now.
So who would actually get this money? Well, the proposal isn't just for one small group. It's designed to cover absolutely everyone who receives Social Security benefits. That means retirees, of course, but it also includes folks on Supplemental Security Income, that's SSI, and Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI. The whole idea is to give a big, broad-based boost to all beneficiaries who are trying to make ends meet on these fixed incomes.
Okay, so why now? Why this big push for a $1,400 payment all of a sudden? Well, the answer really gets into a long-running debate over something called the COLA, the Cost of Living Adjustment. The people behind this payment argue at the system we're using right now to adjust benefits for inflation, well, they say it's fundamentally broken and that millions of people are falling further and further behind because of it.
Every year, Social Security benefits get a little bump, a percentage increase, to help people keep their buying power as the prices for, well, everything go up. That's the COLA. And in theory, it sounds like a perfect system, right? If your rent, your groceries, and your gas all get more expensive, your benefits should go up to match. But, and this is a big but, the core argument of this new proposal is that in the real world, it's just not working that way at all.
The main voice you're hearing behind this push is a nonpartisan group called the Senior Citizens League, or TSCL for short. For years, they've been making this case that the annual COLA increases are, to put it simply, just not enough. They argue there's this growing gap between the benefit increases people get in their checks and the actual real-world inflation they're facing, especially for the big things like housing, food, and of course, healthcare.
And this right here gets to the technical, kind of nerdy heart of the problem. See, the current COLA is calculated using something called the CPIW. It basically tracks the spending habits of younger, working-age people in cities. But critics, like the TSCL, say that's a huge flaw. Why? Because the spending habits of a 40-year-old office worker are completely different from a 75-year-old retiree. For example, seniors spend a much bigger chunk of their income on healthcare, a cost that the CPIW barely registers. So the TSCL wants to switch to the CPIE, which is based on the spending of the elderly. They say this would finally give a true picture of the inflation seniors are up against and lead to much fairer benefit increases.
In this quote from Shannon Benton, the executive director at TSCL, it really frames the whole issue perfectly. For years and years, beneficiaries have been saying, hey, my costs are going up way faster than my benefits. This quote flips the whole script. It says, instead of doubting the lived daily experience of millions of people on fixed incomes, maybe, just maybe, it's time to admit that the tool we're using to measure their costs is the thing that's actually broken.
So moving beyond all the technical arguments about inflation and indexes, what's the real-world evidence for this payment? Well, the TSCL has gathered some really compelling data that, honestly, paints a pretty stark picture of the financial pressures that millions of beneficiaries are dealing with right now, today.
Just let this number sink in for a minute. 7.3 million. According to the TSCL's research, that is how many American seniors are trying to get by on less than $1,000 a month. That's not just a low number, it's below the federal poverty line. And as the organization points out, in most cities, that's less than what you'd pay for just a modest apartment, let alone food, utilities, medicine, everything else. This is the reality that's fueling this urgent call for relief. And this dependency it's absolutely key to understanding the problem. For so many people, Social Security isn't just a little extra check to help out. It's their entire livelihood. This research shows that for nearly 4 out of every 10 beneficiaries, Social Security isn't just part of their income, it is 100% of their income. So when that's your only source of money, even a small gap between your benefit increases and the rising cost of living can be completely devastating.
And when you look at the opinions of the beneficiaries themselves, the message is crystal clear. A survey by the TSCL found just overwhelming support for changing how the COLA is calculated.
We're talking 96% in favor of using an index like the CPIE that actually reflects their spending. The survey also found that 1/5 of seniors are spending over $1,000 a month just on healthcare. And maybe the most telling part, 4 out of 5 felt that inflation was way higher than the official numbers the government was reporting. So this isn't just a policy debate, it's this widespread feeling of being left behind. Now, it's really important to understand that this whole idea of a direct payment isn't just coming out of thin air. There's actually a history of the federal government providing this exact kind of direct assistance. This $1,400 proposal is really part of a much bigger ongoing conversation about how we can strengthen Social Security benefits for everyone. If you look back, you can see some really clear examples. Back during the Great Recession in 2009, the government sent out $250 economic recovery payments to people on Social Security and SSI. And of course, much more recently, during the pandemic, millions of us got those economic impact payments, the stimulus checks. The TSCL points to these examples as proof that when things get economically uncertain, the government can and has stepped in with direct financial help. This new proposal fits right into that pattern.
And this proposal for a one-time payment, it's not the only idea out there for boosting benefits. Not by a long shot. There have been several other pretty big plans discussed recently. For example, Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren brought back the Social Security Expansion Act. That's a bill that would increase benefits by $2,400 a year, so $200 every month. And similarly, during his 2020 campaign, Joe Biden also proposed a $200 per month increase. This all just goes to show that the push for a $1,400 check is part of a much wider call from a lot of different people to provide more substantial support.
So with all of this context, you've got the flawed COLA, the real financial hardship, the history of these kinds of payments, and all these other proposals floating around, we finally get to the big question. We have this compelling proposal on the table. So what happens next? Where does this whole idea go from here?
Okay, this right here is the most important thing to clarify right now. The $1,400 catch-up payment is a proposal from the Senior Citizens League. It is not a bill sitting in Congress, and it is definitely not a law. It's an idea that's being pushed by a very influential advocacy group to spark a conversation and, frankly, to put some pressure on lawmakers. The goal is to get this concept onto the legislative agenda, but as of today, that's what it is, a proposal.
So let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways from all this. First, a major advocacy group, the TSCL, is pushing for a one-time $1,400 payment. Second, this is a direct response to the cost of living adjustments that they say just haven't kept up with real-world inflation for seniors. Third, their case is backed up by some pretty stark data on financial hardship. And finally, this kind of direct payment isn't new. It has been used before during tough economic times.
And that leaves us with this final really crucial question. This $1,400 proposal, it's a potential short-term fix for a very long-term problem. And whether this specific plan ever moves forward or not, the underlying issues, how do we accurately measure inflation for seniors? How do we make sure benefits provide a dignified standard of living? Those questions aren't going away. It really forces all of us to think bigger. As our economy keeps changing, how does this fundamental pillar of our social safety net need to evolve right along with it?
This whole debate has proven one thing for sure. Millions of seniors are struggling financially. But is another benefit increase the real long-term answer? Or is it just the temporary patch on a system that needs fundamental, deep reform to survive for the next generation? That is the real question for the future of Social Security.
So what would it really take for another round of stimulus checks to be sent out? It is, without a doubt, a question on millions of people's minds. And you know what? The answer might be a lot closer than you think. Today, we're going to cut through all the noise and look at the real, concrete economic signals that could actually trigger that next wave of support. Look, this is the question, right? It's probably one of the most common questions being asked right now. And if you're wondering about it, you are definitely not alone. The fact that so many people are even asking tells its own story. A lot of folks are feeling the financial squeeze. But to find the real answer, we can't just look at our own finances. We have to look somewhere else entirely. And this is the fundamental idea we have to start with. A stimulus check, sure, it feels incredibly personal. It lands right in your bank account. But where it comes from? Not personal at all. You have to think of it like a giant emergency lever the government pulls when the entire economic engine of the country starts to stall. They're not trying to fix your personal budget. They're trying to fix the country's economy. Okay, let's really break this down because this gets right to the heart of everything. On one side, you have the common assumption, which makes total sense. People are hurting, they need help, so the government should help. It's logical. But on the other side, you have the economic reality. The government really only acts when the entire economy is in trouble, when it's shrinking, when it's heading for a recession. Those stimulus checks we get are really just a side effect of that much bigger problem. The economy is the patient, and the stimulus check is the emergency medicine. So if we're going to be economic detectives, watching for these signs of weakness, where do we look first? Well, there is one single report that stands head and shoulders above all the rest. It's the most important vital sign for the U.S. economy, and that is the monthly jobs report.
Every first Friday of the month, this report drops, and it's basically a national health checkup. It's the biggest barometer we've got. Now, the unemployment rate, that's the headline number everyone talks about. But the details inside are what really tell the story. You see things like average hourly earnings. Are people's wages actually keeping up with prices? And maybe the most important one is the labor participation rate. That tells us if people are so discouraged that they've just given up looking for a job altogether. Put it all together, and you get a really clear picture of whether the economy is creating jobs or losing them.
I want you to just look at this number for a second. 1.8 million. It's a huge, huge figure. What in the world could that represent? Well, this number is the key to understanding why even tiny little changes in that jobs report have absolutely massive consequences. And there it is. For every single percentage point the unemployment rate goes up, another 1.8 million people have lost their jobs. Just let that sink in. A headline might say unemployment ticked up by 0.1%. That sounds like nothing, right? But that tiny tick means 180,000 people are suddenly out of work. It's not just a statistic. It's a huge wave of disruption hitting families and towns all across the country. And that disruption, it doesn't stop there. This is where we see the snowball effect. It's what economists call a vicious cycle. You see, a weak job market isn't just a one-time thing. It's the start of a chain reaction that can pull the whole economy down. It starts out pretty slow, but believe me, it picks up speed really, really fast. Let's walk through this dangerous cycle. So first, the unemployment rate starts to climb. What happens next? Well, naturally, when people lose their paychecks, they stop spending money. So step 2, consumer spending falls. People put off buying that car or fixing the roof or even just eating out. Then, because customers aren't buying, businesses see their sales drop. So step 3, they contract. They cut back, they cancel plans, and eventually they have to do more layoffs. And that, of course, leads to step 4, pushing the unemployment rate even higher. You see how this works? The cycle just keeps feeding on itself, getting worse each time around. This quote just captures it perfectly. The government is watching this cycle gain speed and momentum. They know that once it really gets going, it's incredibly hard to stop. And that exact moment, when that cycle is threatening to spiral, that's when stimulus checks go from being a vague idea to an urgent plan. The whole point of a stimulus check is to jump right into step 2, to boost consumer spending and try to break that cycle before it gets any worse. So the jobs report is signal number 1 for sure, but there's another really crucial indicator that tells the same story: what the Federal Reserve is doing with interest rates. Watching the Fed gives us a peek behind the curtain at their private assessment of how the economy is really doing. It's really a tale of 2 different approaches. When the economy is running hot and growing fast, the Fed worries about inflation. So they raise interest rates to make borrowing money more expensive, which kind of cools everything down. But the opposite is also true. When the Fed starts cutting interest rates, that is a crystal clear signal that they think the economy is weak and needs a boost. They're making it cheaper to borrow money to try and get businesses and people spending again. And this brings us to a super important rule of thumb.